The elf proved everyone wrong by finishing what they thought she couldn't. The cook was impressed, as even dwarves sometimes fail to finish that special meal, but the elf devoured it all. The cook awkwardly acknowledged that elves are generally known for living off nature and preferring simple food, laughing nervously at the situation. The elf proudly declared herself the greatest glutton of her entire race, warning the cook never to underestimate elves. The elf revealed she had spent 100 years traveling across Granarista, a land of many races, tasting dishes from every region. She had tried everything: seafood, desert fruits, even forest beasts and monster meat, and was now planning her next culinary destination. Someone caught the elf's attention by mentioning rumors about a place called Fahrenheit. The elf was puzzled, finding it odd that such a place would be located in the back alleys. Curious, the elf asked what kind of food it was, and was told it had a flavor unlike anything ever tasted before. Upon hearing it was also incredibly delicious, the elf immediately demanded every detail about the rumor. She learned that rare, extraordinary dishes could supposedly be found hidden in the back alleys. The scene shifted to Fahrenheit, a grand castle town. The elf ventured into the dark alleys, where bizarre dishes were reportedly served completely free of charge. She learned that a mysterious figure appeared there night after night. About a year ago, a strange man had begun appearing in town. The mysterious dish was revealed. It was ramen. A lone man pushed his food cart through the dark alley, and the name of his dish was about to be revealed. The ramen cart rolled through the alley, its sign clearly displaying the dish it offered. The ramen vendor blew his horn, announcing his presence through the dark alleys of the town. The sound of his horn echoed through the night as he pushed his cart along. The elf swiftly moved toward the sound, tracking down the mysterious ramen vendor. The elf was not alone. Others had also been drawn to the vendor, following him through the alleys. The elf paused, puzzled by the strange sound of what seemed to be a flute. Wide-eyed, the elf realized that fellow food connoisseurs were all gathering at the same place. Among the crowd, a gruff dwarf acknowledged her arrival with a smirk. The ramen vendor greeted the large crowd warmly, delighted by yet another packed night at his alley stall. Fired up, the elf vowed she would not be outdone by anyone there. The dwarf showed her the trick, shouting, "Boss, one ramen," was the legendary chant to summon the dish, which left the elf fascinated. The vendor responded with a big smile, cheerfully announcing the order was on its way. The elf and the dwarf sat side by side at the stall, eagerly awaiting their ramen. Caught up in the excitement, the elf nervously attempted the chant herself, ordering one ramen from the boss. The vendor skillfully prepared the ramen, boiling the noodles, pouring the broth, and assembling the bowl with practiced precision. The steaming bowl was placed before her, and the elf was left speechless at the sight of her very first ramen. Nearby, the dwarf was already eagerly preparing his chopsticks, wasting no time. Both of them snapped their chopsticks apart, ready to dig in. The elf stared at the chopsticks in confusion, having no idea how to eat with them and wondering where the fork and spoon were. Meanwhile, the dwarf was already slurping his noodles loudly and blissfully, completely unbothered. Completely unfamiliar with chopsticks, the elf examined them curiously, wondering if they were some kind of ritual object. Her first attempt at holding the chopsticks ended in disaster, snapping them awkwardly in her hands. Undeterred, the elf resolved to give the chopsticks another try. The dwarf demonstrated the technique between loud slurps. You use 2 sticks to grab the noodles and slurp them up, though the elf found the method rather crude. Her hesitation gone, the elf finally gripped her chopsticks and prepared to taste the ramen. The vendor gently placed a hand on her head, stopping her before she could eat. The vendor corrected her chopstick grip, patiently guiding her hands into the proper position. The vendor smiled and demonstrated the proper chopstick technique with ease. With gratitude, the elf gave thanks for the encounter with such a remarkable flavor, treating the moment with reverence. She finally took her first bite, delicately slurping the noodles. The vendor watched quietly, chopsticks in hand, awaiting her reaction. The first taste hit her like a revelation. Her senses exploded as she perceived every ingredient in the broth, from chicken to fish, all at once. Wide-eyed and overwhelmed, The elf felt as though she had discovered an entirely unknown world of flavor. She marveled at the rich broth, layered with chicken and seafood flavors wrapped in savory fat, and the noodles that snapped pleasantly with each bite. She discovered the noodles were kneaded wheat stretched into long strands and boiled, giving them a chewy texture and a rich wheat fragrance. She slurped the noodles with abandon, realizing that the act of slurping itself sent the aroma of wheat and broth rushing through her nose, making it utterly irresistible. She kept slurping, her eyes fixed on the large piece of meat still waiting in the bowl. The elf had a realization. Slurping made perfect sense as it cooled the hot noodles while eating them. Warm to her core in the cold night air, she understood that even the heat of the broth was part of the experience. She then picked up the tender meat with her chopsticks and took a big bite. Her curiosity piqued. She set her sights on the remaining toppings in the bowl. She suddenly remembered something she had nearly forgotten in the excitement. She noticed the aroma of garlic as the soup's heat melted the fat, creating a rich and heavy depth of flavor. She analyzed each element with delight. The seasoning perfectly matched the broth, and the saltiness had soaked deep into the meat, making it incredibly delicious. She identified the meat as pork, slow-simmered for so long that it melted apart tenderly in the mouth. Her eyes landed on a mysterious swirled ingredient in the bowl, and her expectations soared with anticipation. She stared at it intensely, completely focused and determined to uncover its secrets. She analyzed it carefully. It was crunchy and fibrous, salty with a hint of sweetness and a spicy kick from chili, but she couldn't identify what plant it was. The mysterious ingredient was revealed to be bamboo shoots. The dwarf, equally puzzled, had no idea what bamboo shoots were either. The elf gasped in disbelief, shocked that the mysterious ingredient could actually be bamboo shoots. The elf explained that in the Far Eastern lands there grows a plant called bamboo, and before it fully matures, it is known as a bamboo shoot. The elf recalled having tasted it during her travels to the Far East, where it was regarded as a delicacy among gourmets, making it all the more astonishing to find it here, of all places. The elf deduced that the vendor had preserved the bamboo shoots in a rich, salty, oily sauce to bring them here, since the plant grows quickly but has a short season, making it hard to find outside its region. Full of anticipation, the elf turned her attention to the strange, white, jagged topping, certain it too would move her and change her perspective. Marveling at the ingenuity of it all, the elf was captivated as ramen continued to surprise her with one discovery after another. Her expression shifted from puzzlement to quiet satisfaction as she savored the moment. The mysterious white topping turned out to be underwhelming. The elf admitted she had expected too much from it. She struggled to find the right words. It wasn't bad, but compared to everything else, it was simply ordinary. Then it suddenly hit her. A realization widened her eyes in surprise. She realized that halfway through the bowl, the richness of the oil and salt had begun to feel overwhelming, but the ordinary topping was clearly there to provide balance and relief. Astonished, the elf found that after the plain topping, she could taste the ramen far better than before, crying out that it was delicious all over again. Humbled, the elf corrected herself. Every single topping on the dish had a purpose. Nothing was ordinary after all. She admitted to having underestimated it. Its simple taste and texture were designed to reset the palate, bringing back the fresh flavors of the ramen all over again. Pleased by her appreciation, the vendor smiled warmly and offered her an extra topping on the house. Delighted, she discovered it was a perfectly boiled egg, the white springy, the yolk rich and creamy, its light saltiness pairing perfectly with the ramen. With her bowl completely empty and her chopsticks resting aside, the elf exhaled contentedly, declaring she was completely satisfied. She reflected that by eating the simpler ingredients in between the rich ones, the flavors expanded, making a single dish feel like a full-course meal. She concluded that ramen was a dish that incorporated refined gourmet principles while also impressing with entirely new cooking methods. She had once believed dragon tail steak was the finest meat, but the carefully prepared slices of ordinary pork in this ramen were nothing short of astonishing. Walking away under the open sky, She reflected that in her pursuit of rare delicacies and fine cuisine, she had lost sight of the true joy of eating. With a peaceful smile, she realized she needed nothing more. A single bowl had left her more fulfilled than anything else ever had. Then a more practical thought crossed her mind. She had heard the ramen was free. Despite that, the dwarf left a coin on the counter as a gesture of gratitude, thanking the vendor for the meal. With a blissful expression, the elf declared her final verdict. Ramen was truly incredible. The vendor beamed with joy, thanking them warmly and inviting them to come again. Flustered, the elf felt she couldn't simply leave without paying after being treated to something so delicious, and awkwardly blurted out her thanks for the meal. As they walked away from the stall, the dwarf, revealed to be irregular, cheerfully asked the elf how her first ramen experience had been. With a quiet, satisfied smile, the elf gave her simple but heartfelt answer. It was delicious. The dwarf grinned and gave her a backhanded compliment. For an elf, she had a pretty good sense of taste. The elf smiled warmly, admitting it had been a long time since food made her feel so satisfied. Maybe about 200 years. The dwarf sensed her curiosity and told her to follow him, offering to teach her more about ramen. Her eyes soft with wonder, the elf smiled to herself. She needed to know more about ramen. The dwarf announced his return as the two of them arrived at their destination. The dwarf was welcomed home by his cheerful children, while the elf watched the warm scene unfold in quiet surprise. The elf asked if they were his family, and the dwarf proudly confirmed it, hugging his children tightly. The elf noticed the children were of different races, remarking that dwarves were known for having large families. The dwarf made no attempt to hide it. The dwarf explained that ramen was what had brought him and the children together in the first place, leaving the elf visibly moved. The ramen vendor was a mysterious man who didn't even speak their language, and his suspicious appearance kept everyone from approaching him, despite the food he was clearly preparing. About a year ago, a food stall had begun appearing in that back alley, and in the midst of all that, the dwarf's story continued. The vendor had noticed two starving children in rags, and without hesitation, offered them a bowl of ramen. The two children stared at the bowl wide-eyed, overwhelmed by something they had never seen before. Word spread quickly, and soon more street children gathered around the vendor, drawn by the warmth of the food he freely offered. Orphans from the back alleys began gathering around the vendor, yet no one else dared go near him, except the dwarf, whose keen gourmet nose had drawn him there against all caution. The dwarf took his first bite, slurping the noodles with quiet focus. The vendor responded with a warm, beaming smile. The dwarf stepped forward and demanded to try one, having instantly recognized that something truly delicious was being served. One bite was all it took. The dwarf was completely overwhelmed, declaring it delicious with his whole being. The dwarf spread the word, and from then on the stall drew long lines every single night. The vendor, though puzzled, seemed to understand the dwarf's sentiment. It would have been a shame for such a delicious dish to go unnoticed. The elf raised a sharp point. If the dwarf had brought in crowds of paying customers, hadn't he essentially taken food away from the orphans who depended on the vendor's charity? The children in the back alleys had all been abandoned by their parents or had escaped from human traffickers. The adults of the town kept their distance from them, but the children had opened their hearts only to the vendor. At first, the children were wary of the dwarf and kept running away, but through ramen, the two sides were slowly able to open up to each other. The elf learned that Taisho was simply what they called the owner of the stall. The elf gazed quietly, admitting to herself that she had once held the prejudice that all dwarves were greedy, yet the vendor's admirable spirit of service left her reconsidering everything. The dwarf eagerly schemed about opening ramen shops across town to make a fortune, insisting the flavor was destined to become the city's specialty, leaving the elf to quietly wonder if greed was still greed after all. Noticing the elf looked well-traveled, the dwarf revealed his true intention. He had heard that elves kept birds capable of flying 1,000 miles in an instant, and was hoping she would help spread the word about ramen. The elf asked why he had chosen to tell all of this to her specifically. The elf understood completely. A dish of that caliber naturally made one want to share it with the world. Though she noted with a grin that was just the official reason. The real reason was simpler. The ramen had made him want to strike up a conversation with her. The truth was he had been watching her eat the ramen with such pure, unguarded delight that he simply couldn't help himself. With warm smiles, the two finally introduced themselves. The dwarf was Ori Doer, a jeweler by trade, and the elf was Linciel. The vendor smiled warmly, welcoming them back any time. Linciel expressed her deep admiration for the Teisho's ramen, and from that day on, she too was introduced to him and became a regular at the stall. Being accustomed to multiple languages, Linciel learned the Teisho's tongue directly from him and had him teach her everything about ramen, while Ori managed with nothing more than broken words. She learned the name of every component in the bowl: the noodles, the chashu pork, the manwa bamboo shoots, the Naruto fish cake, the yakumi garnishes, each with its own name in the Teisho's language. Linciel proudly revealed that the legendary chant, Teisho, one ramen, translated simply to, "Master Teisho, please give me one ramen." Eyes sparkling with excitement, Linciel marveled at the realization. Ramen truly was a food from an unknown world. As their interactions deepened, something astonishing came to light. The Teisho was from a country that did not exist on this earth. He was a resident of another world. With Linciel acting as his translator, the Teisho's interactions with the townsfolk grew, and he proved to be a kind, honorable man who never refused a request. The townsfolk gathered around with endless curiosity. A cook asked about the Naruto, a farmer wanted to grow yakumi, and others marveled at the manwa and the springy texture of the noodles, with Linciel cheerfully translating every question. Even upon returning to her homeland, Linciel's story of her travels drew attention, and she was asked whether, among all the countries she had visited, she had encountered any food that truly moved her. Wherever her travels took her, Linciel never missed a chance to boast about the ramen, and whenever she left Fahrenheit to visit other towns, she made sure everyone heard about it. With shining eyes, Linciel answered without a moment's hesitation. Above all else, it was the Teisho's ramen, Your Majesty. The queen herself was deeply impressed by the flavor of the ramen, and bestowed an emerald necklace upon the Teisho as a token of her admiration. The queen listened with quiet curiosity, her interest clearly piqued. So moved was she by Linciel's passionate description that the queen ended up coming incognito to taste the ramen herself. Through Linciel's translation, the Teisho humbly declared he would treasure the emerald necklace as a family heirloom. Linciel pressed him firmly. It was a reward granted by the queen herself, and refusing it would bring shame upon Her Majesty. She couldn't believe he would even consider declining something so magnificent. The Teisho was always energetic, refreshing, and full of humanity, a thoroughly pleasant man. After a few years of everyone getting along so well, both Linciel and the entire town had come to absolutely love him. And then, suddenly, the Teisho stopped coming. The Teisho had vanished. No matter how long Linciel, Ori, and the others waited in that alley, he never appeared again, leaving behind only the memory of his smile and the taste of his ramen. Linciel stood in silence, her expression heavy with quiet grief. The others tried to reassure themselves. There had been times before when the Teisho didn't show up due to Obon or New Year's, so perhaps this absence was no different. But as another night passed without him, even that fragile hope began to fade. The Teisho hadn't come again. They had tried everything, even attempting to follow him by grabbing onto his departing cart and seeking a way to reach his world, but never once succeeded. Before they knew it, he was simply gone. The crowd stirred with worry and guilt, each person carrying their own regret, and all of them simply hoping he was all right. In other words, there was simply no way for them to contact the Teisho from their side. Ori gazed into the distance, murmuring quietly that the Teisho was such a selfless man. After all, Ori had been the one to set the prices, insisting it would be a total waste otherwise. Yet even so, the Teisho had still refused to keep the profits for himself. Even when crowds began gathering at his stall, the Teisho refused to take any money, insisting it was all just leftovers. Instead, he had told them to use the money for the children. Linciel's gaze grew distant as she recalled something the Teisho had told her once, a long time ago. He had said that when he first wandered into this world by mistake, he could never forget the way those children ate his ramen. Whenever he thought about those starving children, he simply couldn't bear it, and so he'd started coming down to the back alleys of that otherworldly town, night after night. She remembered the warmth of his hand, gently resting on her head. The children arrived at the alley asking for the teisho, their voices filled with innocent longing. Then one of the children called out the word that said everything. Daddy? Ori knelt down with quiet resolve. In order to put the teisho's mind at ease, they had to keep those children's bellies completely full. Yet there was one desire the people simply could not give up. They simply could not come to terms with the fact that the teisho was gone. And so, little by little, the townsfolk gradually came to terms with his absence. But one cry united them all. They wanted to eat ramen again. With the teisho gone, they knew they would never be able to eat that ramen again. And so everyone struggled in their own way to at least recreate that identical flavor. Farmers grew yakumi lush and green in the fields, processed bamboo shoots into manwa to import them, simmered chashu from the pigs they raised, mashed white fish, and steamed it into naruto, each person contributing what they knew best. Now, numerous ramen shops stood side by side throughout the city, and ramen had become the specialty dish of Fahrenheit. Yet, as Linciel tasted the new ramen, her expression grew troubled. Something was missing. However, she slurped the noodles anyway. In the end, under the light of the full moon, only a few remained waiting for the teisho in that alley. In the end, it was just the two of them, Ori and Linciel, still waiting in that empty alley. Linciel smiled quietly, her resolve unshaken. Even so, she would wait. Whether it took 100 years or even 200. Ori grumbled that it had already been 20 years, and unlike long-lived elves and dwarves, that was far too long for most people. A cold wind swept through the alley. Linciel shivered, remarking how truly freezing the night was, and Ori lamented that on a night like this, there was nothing they wanted more than the teisho's piping hot ramen. Then, as if in answer to their longing, a heavy bowl was placed before them, and the familiar warmth of steam enveloped them as they snapped apart their chopsticks. With her eyes closed in quiet bliss, Linciel savored every element, pulling up the noodles and slurping them down, biting into the tender chashu, savoring the crunchy manwa, taking a sip of the piping hot soup, and resting with the chewy naruto. With quiet longing in her eyes, Linciel admitted what she truly wanted, to see him again. And then, that sight she missed most of all, the teisho smiling warmly as he watched her eat. Ori laughed softly, noting it was another swing and a miss that night. Neither of them ever seemed to learn their lesson. Then both of them froze. Something had caught their attention in the alley. Their eyes wide, both of them had heard it, a sound drifting through the night that neither could mistake. For a brief moment, Linciel's mind raced with doubt. Could it be an illusion created by a displacer beast, or perhaps a curse cast by the eyeball of a beholder? But even so, she couldn't hold back her hope. There was no mistake, that whistle sound, that stall. The teisho had returned. The teisho stood there with his warm, familiar smile, confused by their reaction, unaware that 20 years had passed. And yet, all Linciel could say through her overwhelming emotion was that she had been waiting all this time. With tears in their eyes and joy bursting from their hearts, Linciel and Ori welcomed him back, the 20 years of waiting melting away in a single moment. Beaming with his signature warmth, the teisho threw open his stall and greeted them with the same cheerful energy as always. Welcome to Ramen Teo. Linciel and Ori stared at him in stunned silence, completely at a loss for words. The teisho paused, letting out a quiet sound of realization as he took in the two familiar faces standing before him. But then, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, the teisho hit them with the devastating truth. He had no idea who they were. After 20 long years, just when they thought the teisho had finally returned, he didn't remember them at all. Linciel and Ori stood there, pale and speechless, the joy of reunion shattered in an instant, staring up at the unfamiliar man before them. Only one question burned in their minds. Who in the world was this guy? Two strangers locked eyes, a bearded dwarf and a pointy-eared elf, each instantly struck by the other's most defining feature. The vendor shot up in shock upon seeing the two familiar faces, his reaction explosive and overwhelming, while Linciel and Ori watched him in stunned silence. Overwhelmed with amazement, the young vendor confirmed with his own eyes what his father's diary had described. Another world truly existed. Ori and Linciel watched him in confusion, having no idea who he was. The young vendor flashed a wide, confident grin, the same warmth as his father's smile. The young man introduced himself boldly as Rin Ito, while Ori, unmoved, immediately asked where the real Teisho was. Linciel repeated the name in disbelief, Tatsuhiro Ito. Rin was the son of the man who once pulled that very food stall, leaving both her and Ori speechless. Overcome with emotion, Linciel grabbed Rin and desperately demanded to know where the Teisho was now. Rin quietly revealed that his father had passed away 20 years ago. The words hit Linciel and Ori like a blow, leaving them frozen in silence. Rin stood in quiet shadow, his expression heavy with the weight of his father's absence. Linciel stared in disbelief, her eyes wide and trembling, unable to process what she had just heard. Rin revealed the cause. His father had been struck by a truck in a traffic accident. Rin admitted that at the time, he had assumed his father's stories about another world were nothing but accident-induced delusions. For 3 days and nights, his father hovered between life and death. Yet even unconscious, he kept muttering that he had to bring ramen to the people here. Rin smiled softly, the reality finally sinking in. The people his father had devoted himself to were real all along. Linciel and Ori stood there shaken, tears welling, the weight of the moment hitting them as they realized the Teisho had never stopped thinking of them, even in his final hours. Ori's voice broke as he recalled how the Teisho had fed them such incredibly delicious ramen. Linciel whispered the Teisho's name, her voice barely holding. She had always known he was too honorable a man to simply vanish without a word. Rin stood quietly, carrying the same weight. They had never been able to repay his father for everything he had done. Rin shot back firmly, having read his father's diary. The Teisho had written that they had taken great care of him, and that was far from nothing. Rin pulled out the diary and confirmed their names, the elf and the dwarf, Linciel and Ori, leaving Linciel visibly shaken to hear her own name written in the Teisho's hand. Linciel's eyes fixed on the diary. She recognized the emerald necklace the queen had once bestowed upon the Teisho. Rin smiled softly, sharing what his father had written, that everyone in this world had been his savior, and that the two of them especially held a place in his heart. Rin recalled a painful memory. As a child, he had sat crying, terrified he was going to lose his mother. His mother's illness was life-threatening, and the medical bills were so astronomical that selling both their house and the food stall wouldn't have been enough to cover them. When Rin was just a child, his mother had suddenly collapsed before his eyes. Through it all, his father had faced him with a calm, reassuring smile, telling him not to worry, that everything was going to be okay. Against all odds, his father had managed to scrape together the money, and his mother was saved. His father had pawned the gems from the queen's necklace and worked himself to the bone paying back the massive loan. But halfway through, the accident took him. Rin held the necklace with quiet reverence. His mother's life had been saved because of it. Rin stood firm, his back turned as he declared his purpose. He had crossed into another world to deliver the gratitude his father had left written in his diary. Rin revealed his 2 goals: to restore the necklace and return it to the queen with his gratitude, and to feed ramen to everyone his father had bonded with in this world. Rin sat quietly, admitting he had only learned all of this after his father's death, through the diary he left behind. Rin handed the necklace to Linciel with a calm smile, acknowledging the gems were incomplete, but asking her to return it to the queen on his behalf. Linciel pushed back with emotion. The missing gems were not a flaw, but proof of how hard the Teisho had lived his life. Ori stood firm beside Linciel. Neither of them could accept taking the necklace back. With warm smiles, the two introduced themselves properly to Rin for the first time. Linciel and Ori Doer, the elf, and the dwarf his father had never stopped writing about. Rin stood still, quietly taking in the names his father had written about so many times. After a brief pause, Rin accepted their words quietly, deciding to keep the necklace as a memento of his father. With a warm smile, Rin told them to just call him Rin, and the 3 of them exchanged their first real greeting, the beginning of a new bond carrying his father's legacy forward. Rin's face lit up the moment ramen was mentioned. That was all it took to get his full attention. Linseal gestured toward the stall, the same one his father once pushed, and asked if Run, as his son, could also make that ramen. Ori fixed Run with a sharp, expectant glare, the question hanging in the air. Linseal and Ori leaned in together, barely containing themselves, both demanding to know if Ren could make ramen too. Ren declared with full confidence that he had crossed worlds just to fulfill his father's last wish, and they were about to taste the ramen he had spent years perfecting. Their excitement quickly faltered. The smell was nothing like the Teisho's fragrant broth, and both of them sensed something was off. Ren worked behind the counter, while Linseal and Ori watched closely, their unease growing with every passing moment. Ren proudly slammed the bowl down, but one look at it left Linseal and Ori completely speechless. Linseal's face fell. The smell was not inviting at all, closer to boiled animal glue than anything resembling ramen. The cloudy, white broth staring back at them looked nothing like the Teisho's beautiful, clear soup. The toppings were chashu, yakumi, and minma, but the sheer amount of green onions piled on top left Linseal utterly horrified. Linseal slammed her hands down and exploded. This was wrong. This was not ramen at all. Ren stared down at the bowl, muttering quietly to himself. Something just like this was what he had been chasing all along. Ren turned to Linseal with a sharp look, unfazed, asking if she had a problem with his ramen. Linseal erupted into a passionate lecture, describing in vivid detail exactly what real ramen was supposed to look, smell, and taste like. Ren laughed, suddenly understanding. His father had been a strictly traditional chuka soba-style cook, which explained everything. Ren pushed back, baffled. How could something that looked and smelled so terrible even be called ramen, let alone made with seafood and chicken broth? Ren fired back with equal passion. His ramen used a rich veggie pork bone broth, slowly simmered until thick, and that depth of flavor was every bit the culinary masterpiece she described. Linseal snapped her chopsticks apart in defiance, flatly refusing to recognize what was in front of her as ramen. Ori, who had quietly taken a bite, froze, his eyes wide, completely caught off guard by what he tasted. Linseal spun around in disbelief. Ori was already eating, completely unbothered by her protest. Ori was slurping the ramen loudly and relentlessly, completely lost in the bowl. Ori admitted between slurps that Linseal was right. He couldn't call it ramen either, but he kept eating anyway. Ori suddenly stopped mid-bite, something having caught his full attention. Ori paused, a single word escaping his lips, but Linseal leaned over triumphantly as Ori confirmed it. This thing wasn't ramen, exactly as she had said. Ori's eyes went wide. It wasn't ramen, but it was insanely delicious. Ren stood arms crossed as Linseal reluctantly conceded. Yes, it looked like thick sludge and smelled terrible. Linseal stared at the bowl, quietly acknowledging it was completely different from the Teisho's clear, beautiful ramen. Linseal stood silent, her expression heavy, and even she could fully understand why she was so angry. Linseal's expression softened into quiet contemplation. Was this simply a completely different dish from ramen altogether? Ori leaned in with wide eyes. Just try eating it while thinking of it as a completely different dish from ramen altogether. Ori admitted that approaching it as an unfamiliar dish made it actually pretty delicious. Besides, he could never resist trying a rare food regardless. Linseal's resistance began to crack. Even she couldn't deny the pull of an unknown flavor. Linseal remembered who she was. A traveler who had crossed the entire world seeking new dishes and flavors. One who never flinched before any delicacy, no matter how bizarre. Her eyes sharp with resolve, Linseal steeled herself. Backing down now would be a disgrace to her name as a gourmand. With a resolute thud, Linseal sat down before the bowl, ready to face it head-on. Linseal closed her eyes and pressed her hands together, offering her customary prayer of gratitude before the meal. Linseal raised her chopsticks as Run watched quietly, awaiting her verdict. Linseal's eyes widened as the first taste hit her. The broth was as heavy as mud. A silent contrast. Linseal's chopstick grip, still imperfect, beside Ren's practiced and effortless hold. Linseal lifted the noodles and noticed the thick, sludge-like broth clinging tightly to every strand, then brought them to her lips and slurped. Words failed her. Linseal's eyes went wide and glassy, her expression saying everything she couldn't. Linseal slurped relentlessly. Yes, the appearance was poor and the smell was unique, but the taste of that thick soup coating every noodle was something else entirely. Linseal's analytical mind took over. The flavors of every ingredient wove together in perfect harmony, bound by a viscous oil that wrapped everything in an exquisite saltiness. Linseal marveled at the complexity. The noodle's wheat aroma held its own against the rich soup, the flavor profile layered with a hint of seafood, and the grainy texture on the tongue reminded her of a thick potage. The thickly cut manwa offered a refreshing contrast, while the thinly sliced chashu complemented the heaviness of the broth perfectly. Linseal found herself surrendering. The foul odor no longer bothered her. The abundant yakumi kept the aftertaste light, and that one soft pudding aroma escaping through her nose had somehow become completely addictive. Linseal leaned deeper into the bowl, bewildered. The soup was endlessly creamy, its rich body and savory depth unfolding in complex layers, and she needed to keep eating just to understand it. The bowl sat empty. Linseal had eaten every last drop. With a quiet, defeated smile, Linseal finally gave her verdict. It was delicious. Exceptionally delicious. Linseal placed her hand gently on Ren's head, the same gesture his father had once given her. Both Linseal and Ori stood firm on one point. It was delicious, but it simply wasn't ramen. Linseal leaned in nose-to-nose with Ren, unwavering. Even so, she still could not recognize it as ramen. Unfazed, Ren looked up with a calm expression and asked if they had some time to spare. Linseal leaned over Ren with a wide smile while Ori pointed approvingly. They were going to take him to taste real ramen. Ori thundered ahead with full force, leading the charge. They were heading to Ram's shop for real ramen right now. Ren was dragged along, half asleep, drowsily muttering that his father-in-law had no mercy dragging him out in the middle of the night like this. They arrived at the shop, where the owner recognized Ori and Linseal, but looked puzzled at the unfamiliar figure behind them. Ren froze. The shop owner was speaking a completely foreign language, leaving him totally lost. Linseal revealed that she and Ori had been practicing Japanese together to keep the language alive in his absence, then greeted Ren in his father's tongue. Linseal informed the reader that from that point on, all conversations between Ren and the others would be translated by either her or Ori, and that Ren was unable to communicate on his own. The ramen shop owner was shocked to learn that Ren was the Teisho's son. Ren marveled at the otherworldly ramen shop, while the owner hurriedly opened up and invited them inside. The shop owner was Vlad, one of the orphans from the back alleys. He and his younger sister had been starving when the Teisho's ramen saved them. He later became Ori's adopted son and now ran the shop. The shop served the ramen that Ori and Vlad had created together. Having grown up eating the Teisho's ramen, Vlad had spared no money or effort researching ramen alongside Ori. Everyone in town had scrambled to reproduce the taste of the Teisho's ramen. Vlad's shop, known as the Golden Minma Pavilion, had become a #1 ramen shop in Fahrenheit. Vlad explained that they used a large, salt-dried, red-fleshed ocean fish, combining its broth with another ingredient to create a blended sauce for the ramen. Ren was surprised to recognize the ingredient as dried tuna. Vlad offered Ren a taste of the blended sauce, and Ren was struck by how closely it resembled soy sauce. Vlad explained that he and Ori had ordered sauces from all over the world until they found one that could recreate the flavor of the Teisho's broth. The sauce came from a southern island, made by fermenting the sap of coconut trees. Vlad proudly presented their signature golden soup. The golden soup was made by simmering chicken bones, apples, onions, yakumi greens, ginger, garlic, naga queso, and ogorite for 8 hours without boiling, then skimming the scum and straining it through a cloth. The noodles were made by pressing kneaded dough through a mold and then letting them rest for a few days to mature. Ren asked how the noodles were made, and Vlad explained they were a mix of wheat flour, eggs, and clarified liquid from ash. Vlad explained that the ash liquid gave the noodles a yellow color and chewy texture, and that the recipe had been perfected with the help of an alchemist master who loved ramen. Vlad recalled that when the noodles were finally perfected, Ori had been absolutely thrilled. Overcome with emotion, Ori declared the noodles were unmistakably the Teisho's own and immediately ordered the recipe to be shared with all the other ramen shops in town. Rin deduced that the clarified ash liquid was alkaline potassium, acting as a substitute for Kansui. Vlad explained that all ramen shops in town used noodles made with the exact same method, as Ori had insisted it shouldn't be monopolized and shared it freely. A close-up of the Naruto fish cake being lifted by chopsticks, broth being poured over the noodles in the bowl. Vlad served the ramen and invited them to dig in, with Linciel and Ori eagerly snapping their chopsticks apart and declaring it was time to eat. As Linciel savored the ramen, she marveled at the wheat-scented noodles and the perfect harmony of chicken fat and seafood flavor in the broth, declaring it to be truly ramen. Linciel praised Vlad, noting his skills had improved once again, and Rin thanked him warmly. Rin was amazed, recognizing it as a proper classic Chinese-style noodle soup, and marveled that Vlad had built it from scratch using nothing but his childhood memories of the Teisho's ramen. Vlad smiled, touched by Rin's words, but humbly admitted his ramen still hadn't reached the level of the Teisho's. Vlad reflected that his life had been saved by the Teisho, and that he had been raised by Ori and Linciel. Recreating delicious ramen and making the two of them happy was his purpose in life. With resolve in his eyes, Vlad turned to Run and told him he had a request. Vlad asked Run, as the son of the Teisho, to let him taste his ramen. Linciel eagerly agreed, adding that she also wanted Vlad to try Ren's ramen and share his opinion, while Ori was already drinking straight from his bowl, unbothered. Ren accepted with enthusiasm, declaring he would serve Vlad the ultimate ramen he had created. A girl named Maria burst in excitedly, revealed to be Vlad's younger sister. Vlad eagerly declared he would go fetch Maria so she could try Ren's ramen too. Maria came rushing in, calling out for her brother Vlad. Maria burst in with another girl, both buzzing with excitement and asking if it was really true that the Teisho's son was there, leaving Vlad and Linciel taken aback. Walking through the dark alley, Maria remarked to Vlad how nostalgic it felt, and he quietly agreed. Vlad reflected that though they had endured many painful times in that alley, it was also the very place where they had found happiness by meeting the Teisho. Maria agreed, quietly admitting that if it had just been the two of them, it would have been too heartbreaking to ever return to that place. Standing together in the alley, Vlad and Maria quietly called out the Teisho's name, hoping he was at peace in heaven. Rin cheerfully announced 2 bowls of ramen were on their way. Rin slammed the bowls down before Vlad and Maria, urging them to eat while it was hot, leaving both of them stunned by the impact. Vlad stared at the bowl in confusion, questioning whether it was even ramen, while Linciel smirked quietly. That was exactly the reaction she had expected. Rin pressed them to eat quickly before it got cold, and Vlad snapped to attention, ready to try it. The moment Vlad and Maria took their first bite, their eyes went wide. The thick, silky broth clinging to the noodles had struck them both with full force. Both devoured their bowls completely, with Vlad declaring it had been absolutely delicious. Vlad was deeply moved, marveling at the rich, heavy broth and declaring he had never tasted anything like it. Linciel shot Rin a smug look, pointing out that no one would ever call that ramen, exactly as she had told him. Vlad hesitated, a flicker in his eyes suggesting he wasn't entirely done with his verdict. Vlad stated firmly that it was ramen, while Maria quietly agreed, saying she thought so too. Vlad argued that it had all the essentials: noodles, broth in the bowl, and disposable chopsticks to slurp it with. Maria added that it warmed her right to the core and that the feeling was exactly the same as when she had eaten the Teisho's ramen as a child. Maria declared that no matter what anyone said, even if told it wasn't ramen, that was simply how it felt to her, and nothing would change her mind. Maria turned to her brother Vlad with something on her mind. Vlad reflected that even without Naruto, ramen was still ramen, and that the richness of the broth varied from shop to shop. Maria challenged the very notion of real ramen, questioning whether missing a Naruto, having thick chashu, or a broth too dark or too light would disqualify something from being ramen at all. Linciel grew quiet, her expression heavy as she acknowledged that the Teisho, who had shown them all how it was done, was no longer there. Maria pointed out to Vlad that if ramen had strict rules for everything, from every strand of noodle to every ingredient in the broth, Then even his ramen wouldn't count as ramen either, and Vlad quietly agreed. Maria's question hung in the air. If that was the case, then where in the world was this real ramen supposed to be? Ren slammed his hand down emphatically, declaring that was exactly his point, leaving Maria startled. Ren enthusiastically praised Maria, declaring she had hit the nail right on the head. Something like real ramen simply didn't exist in this world. Lincio was left completely stunned by Ren's declaration. Ren clarified that what his father had served was just one style of ramen, known as chuka soba. Ren acknowledged his father's ramen was delicious and that he had memorized the recipe without changing the chashu seasoning. Ren revealed that in his world, ramen was far more free and diverse, with countless varieties such as salt, miso, tonkatsu, tsukmen, torai paitan, and shoyu tonkatsu. Ren passionately declared that ramen had limitless possibilities across countless styles and varieties. All that truly mattered was that it tasted good. Ren described the true essence of ramen, the use of disposable chopsticks to slurp the noodles, and the culinary technique that elevated common ingredients to the level of art. Lincio reflected that it was ramen that had completely shattered her preconceived notions. Lincio recalled that when she first tasted the Teisho's ramen, it was that very freedom of thought, that limitless quality, that had captured her heart. Lincio realized that her obsession with Ren's ramen had stemmed from the same shock she felt when first tasting the Teisho's, an emotional impact she had never experienced before. Lincio admitted that because her memories with the Teisho were too precious and his ramen too dazzling, she had been afraid to acknowledge a new kind of ramen and had pretended not to notice. Lincio's expression softened into a quiet, gentle smile as Ori watched her warmly beside her. Lincio humbly admitted to Ren that she had been wrong, declaring his creation was unmistakably ramen, while Ori enthusiastically agreed, calling it an exceptionally delicious bowl. Ren laughed softly, remarking that his stubborn benefactors had finally come around. Lincio fell quiet, deep in thought. Vlad noted that Ren's ramen alone had already been shocking enough, and asked what was on her mind. Lincio mused that there must be countless other unknown styles of ramen in Ren's world. Ren smiled and declared he would make them all for her. Ori's eyes lit up as he realized Ren was offering to make other kinds of ramen for them too. Lincio gripped her bowl with frustration, lamenting that she had no way of going to Ren's world to taste all those ramen for herself. Ren reminded her that he had trained at all sorts of shops and could recreate the flavors quite closely, leaving Lincio beaming with excitement and disbelief. Lincio eagerly begged Ren to let her experience even more varieties of ramen, and he cheerfully told her to leave it to him. Ori and Vlad reflected that they had been so intensely chasing the Teisho's ramen that they may have trapped themselves within their own fixed ideas, though it couldn't be helped, as his ramen had truly been that amazing. Lincio conceded that while Ren's ramen was delicious, it might be a bit too heavy to eat every day. Ori admitted that while Ren's ramen was definitely delicious, he still loved the Teisho's ramen the best, and that it was the one he'd want to eat every single day. Ren laughed dryly, having been completely confident his ramen wouldn't lose to his father's. Lincio remarked that compared to the Teisho's, Ren's ramen had plenty of impact, but felt like something was missing. Ren fell silent, visibly deflated, while Lincio smiled warmly beside him. Maria declared she absolutely loved Ren's ramen, and Vlad added that its richness might actually make him prefer it over the Teisho's, leaving Ren pleasantly surprised. Maria introduced herself simply as Maria, and Ren greeted her warmly in return. Lincio pointed out that despite being completely different broths, both Ren's and Vlad's ramen shared the exact same lack she had sensed, and Ren agreed, saying he had felt it too. Lincio acknowledged that Ren's ramen was certainly delicious, but it lacked that certain something, a touch of nostalgia that they had always found in the Teisho's ramen. Ren was struck by the realization, the same lack present in both Vlad's ramen and his own. Ren and Vlad eagerly demanded to know what it was, but Lincio told them to hold their horses. Ren suddenly had a flash of inspiration, exclaiming he had figured it out, leaving Vlad stunned. Ren told them to come back in 3 days, promising to have them eat his ramen and reveal the answer then. Ren asked Lincio how much she could eat, and she replied with a confident smile that she could eat as much as he had to offer, as long as the ramen was delicious. Rin asked if she liked garlic, and Lincio replied that garlic was a staple of ramen, wasn't it? Rin asked if she liked extra fat, and Lincio replied that fat was the very source of umami in ramen. Lincio acknowledged that while excessive saltiness could mask the individual flavors of the ingredients, she didn't particularly mind it. Rin then asked whether she preferred her ramen on the salter side. Satisfied with her answer, Rin smiled confidently and challenged her to go ahead and call out her order. The three shouted their customized orders simultaneously, all requesting extra vegetables, garlic, and fat, with Lincio also adding extra salty broth. Lincio smiled with quiet wonder, amazed that there was yet another way to summon ramen besides the legendary chant she already knew, and wondered excitedly what kind of ramen awaited her this time. Vlad quickly intervened, warning Maria to hold back on the extra toppings, which left her surprised. A towering, overwhelming bowl of ramen was served, noodles piled impossibly high, with chashu and toppings buried beneath the mountain. Lincio stared at the colossal bowl in utter disbelief, completely speechless at the sight before her, unable to comprehend how Rin could possibly call that ramen. Rin enthusiastically introduced it as Jiroke ramen, explaining that its defining characteristic was its overwhelming volume, and urged them to eat before it got cold, while Lincio refused outright in the background. Lincio and Ori stared at the mountain of ramen in dismay, both overwhelmed by the absurd portion size and at a complete loss for how to even begin eating it. The bowl revealed its monstrous composition: a massive heap of minced garlic, an incredibly thick and fatty slice of chashu, and a mountain of vegetables piled so high it threatened to spill over. Despite her bewilderment, Lincio steeled herself. Whatever it tasted like, she had no choice but to eat it and find out. With quiet gratitude for the chance encounter with a new flavor, Lincio pressed her hands together in her customary prayer and dove in. Lincio took her first bite, slurping the thick, heavily coated noodles. Lincio chewed through the boiled vegetables with a steady, rhythmic crunch, her expression calm and focused. As she chewed through the endless mountain of vegetables, Lincio grew frustrated. The bland, watery taste reminded her of simple elven village food, and no matter how much she ate, the noodles buried beneath remained completely out of reach. She pressed on, continuing to crunch through the towering pile of vegetables. Finally reaching the noodles, Lincio was struck by how remarkably thick they were. Lincio finally grasped the noodles with her chopsticks, remarking on their surprising resistance and heavy weight. She brought the noodles to her lips and slurped, and then came the taste. Lincio was stunned. The noodles were an immense 4 times thicker than any standard noodle she had ever encountered. The flavor hit her all at once, overwhelmingly salty and incredibly intense, leaving her wide-eyed with shock. Reeling from the intensity, Lincio quickly realized that the bland vegetables were meant to be eaten alongside the broth to balance out its remarkable saltiness. It all clicked. The mountain of bland vegetables existed precisely to reset the palate against the intensely salty broth, a balance that had completely caught her off guard. Lincio confirmed her realization, chewing steadily. The natural sweetness of the vegetables softened and toned down the broth's intense saltiness. Rin firmly stated that leaving leftovers was forbidden in Jiroke. Lincio steeled herself, determined to finish. She still had the Teisho's mystery to solve. Lincio admitted the ramen didn't taste bad, even if it was excessive and mismatched in both quantity and flavor, but something still nagged at her. Lincio fell into a rhythm, slurping the noodles, biting into the tender, fatty chashu, then reaching for more vegetables to recover from the sharp garlic and spice, over and over again. Completely consumed, Lincio devoured the ramen with wild, unstoppable intensity. She cycled through the bowl mechanically, vegetables, noodles, meat, vegetables, noodles, repeat. Before she even realized it, Lincio found herself completely entranced, shoveling the ramen into her mouth over and over. Lincio stared in disbelief at her own hands. This simply would not stop. In that moment, Lincio was entirely captivated, completely lost in the colossal bowl of ramen before her. She marveled at the noodles. Their thickness was perfect, giving them a firm, satisfyingly chewy texture. Linseal conceded. The ramen was bold and aggressive in flavor, but its deliciousness was simply undeniable. Though the broth hit overwhelmingly salty at first, aggressively devouring the ultra-thick noodles released their rich wheat flavor, balancing everything out beautifully. It was all about the broth. The vegetables soaked in it took on an entirely new flavor. The chashu had been simmered until it melted in the mouth, and the raw garlic delivered sharp, electrifying punches at regular intervals. Linseal deduced the broth was made from simmered pork bones and meat. Shards of fat floated on top, making it rich and salty. Yet beneath all that heavy intensity, she could still perceive a distinct sweetness and a powerful umami that refused to be drowned out. Eyes sparkling, Linseal was completely won over. Eating it felt like assembling a puzzle, making it the most fun and exhilarating bowl of ramen she had ever experienced. Every element seemed overdone and mismatched on its own. Yet the moment it entered her mouth, the contrasting ingredients complemented one another masterfully, leaving behind a lingering, highly addictive deliciousness. Linseal noticed the noodles had expanded from absorbing the broth, stealing herself. Leaving leftovers was strictly forbidden, and this was no time to go easy. Linseal gasped. The noodles had swelled to nearly 1.5 times their original size. Despite eating for a while, Linseal felt as though the amount in the bowl hadn't decreased at all. Linseal stared at the bowl in dismay. It simply was not decreasing. Linseal pressed on with sheer determination. But even she, proud hearty eater that she was, had to admit the end was nowhere in sight, and that even her limits were being tested by the terrifying extra veggies, extra garlic and fat order. The bowls were finally empty. Rin praised everyone for their great appetite, while Linseal and Ori sat exhausted but satisfied, savoring a well-earned glass of water. Rin turned to them with a grin, eager to hear their verdict on the ramen. Ori declared it perfectly suited a dwarf's palate. Linseal admitted the intensity startled her at first, but as she ate, all the flavors blended beautifully into a wonderful, lingering aftertaste. Maria praised the chashu and vegetables enthusiastically, eager to recreate it herself, while Vlad admitted skipping the extra veggies was the only reason he managed to finish. Rin explained that the triumphant feeling of having conquered a massive bowl was precisely what made Jiroke so great. Rin looked over at the group with a smile, asking how everyone was feeling. Rin smiled and announced it was time to explain the touch of nostalgia they felt for the Teisho's ramen. Linseal reflected on the curious connection. The Jiroke and the Teisho's ramen looked nothing alike and were completely different styles, yet they shared the exact same aftertaste and brought back a strange sense of nostalgia. Vlad leaned in urgently, demanding to know the secret behind it, and Rin began to reveal the answer. Rin slammed the answer on the table. MSG. Rin explained that MSG, monosodium glutamate, was what people nowadays called umami seasoning, leaving Vlad puzzled by the unfamiliar term. Rin described MSG as a magical powder that instantly made any dish delicious, leaving Linseal and Vlad stunned, and immediately demanding to taste it directly. They tasted it directly. It was only slightly salty, leaving them skeptical of whether it was truly the magical powder Rin had described. Linseal tasted it carefully, puzzled. It seemed to have almost no flavor at all. Rin explained that despite having almost no taste or smell, MSG left a deep richness lingering on the tongue. And precisely because it lacked competing flavors, it would never interfere with the taste of any dish it was added to. Rin added that even a poorly made bowl of ramen would end up tasting decent enough with just a sprinkle of MSG. Vlad erupted with excitement, declaring that was exactly it, exactly what had been missing, praising Rin as a true ramen chef. Overwhelmed, Vlad quietly wondered if this magical powder was truly what he had been searching for all those years. Vlad marveled at the thought that a single powder could make even a poorly made bowl of ramen taste delicious. Rin laughed, acknowledging it was so ridiculously powerful that it made all their years of hard work feel utterly pointless.